Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome to the fifth tutorial of the series Special Effects for Games in Unity. I'm using Unity 5.5 and today we are going to see how to create this crazy ground attack with rocks coming from the underground. You can find more tutorials of special effects in my channel and you can have access to all the effects and more in my Patreon page. So let's see how we can do this. And as a good practice, we start by creating an empty game object, which is going to be called Particle System Ground Rocks or similar. We also need to create a folder with the same name. Now let's add our first particle system, which we want to rename it to something like Ground Crack. And rotate it minus 90 degrees in the x-axis so it faces up. And since this is not going to move too much, we don't need any start speed. So let's set it to 0. And we are also going to make all the particle systems with a duration of 7 and most of them will need a material. So let's create one for the ground crack and we can give it the same name just for consistency. And in shader we want to choose particle additive. Now we need an image of a crack and I created mine in Photoshop. You can also Google for ground crack. But I'm gonna give you some quick and simple hints on how I created this and I hope you can recreate something similar. So I started by creating a new file with 2000 by 2000, set the background to black because I'm gonna paint in white, and then I created a new layer. In this layer, after choosing a nice brush like this one, I painted the center and started creating these large placeholders for the cracks. Now I'm going to start to give some details. And I'm going to use the erase tool to make sure that the extremities are smaller than the center of the crack. After doing these small details that works like a spider web, I use the smudge tool to give a nice blurry effect, and it will also help to glue everything together. And I only do half of the crack, then I duplicate it, rotate it and mirror it. Now I duplicate these two layers as a safe copy and merge them with Ctrl E. In the merged layer, I access the layer style to give a white outer glow, which will make this look much better. I added the black background and export it as a PNG to Unity. Drag the ground crack image we created to the slot and then drag the material to the ground crack particle system. Let's change the max particles to 1 for now. And for this to appear horizontally, we want to go to the last parameter, the renderer, and select horizontal billboard. Let's also make sure that every particle born has a lifetime of 3 between 5 and that the start rotation is rendered between 0 and 360 degrees. And for now we want the start size to be rendered between 6 and 10, and that's good. Okay, so let's set the rate over time to 0, because we want to use bursts. And we can add 3 bursts in the plus icon. And the first burst is at 0, the second at 0.2 and the third at 0.4. And I'm setting a minimum and a maximum of 5 for each burst, but you can set a little bit more. And now we will limit the amount of particles in the max particles to around 15. And for this to appear in a different position within the radius, we can go to the shape and increase the radius like this, and I settle down with a value of 4 and 90 degrees for the angle. Now let's smooth the beginning and the ending of each crack, and also add some color in the color of a lifetime. I already have all these presets that I created, but what really matters for you to create something like this is that the keys on top control the alpha, in other words the opacity, and the bottom keys control the color. And by the way, you can add keys by pressing in a blank space with the left mouse. Now we also want to go to the renderer and set the max particle size to at least 3, otherwise if we get closer to the particles they will shrink. Now let's create the ground beam, which we can duplicate from the ground cracks, and the ground beam will give a sensation that the ground is very hot. Let's also create a new material with the same name, and now we are going to need an image similar to this one. And it's really easy to create one in Photoshop. Just use a brush with an opacity of around 25 and start painting from big circles to small circles. Or you can Google for point of light. Now import it to Unity, drag to the material and drop the material on top of the ground beam. Let's make the ground beams a little bit bigger and change the start size. Now let's scroll down and turn on lights, which is only available from Unity 5.5 and beyond. This requires a light input and I have a point light prefab, nothing special, you just need to create a point light and decrease the range to 4. Now we can go back to the ground beams particle system and drop the prefab to the slot. We don't see anything because we need to increase the ratio to 1. We can also increase the intensity and the range. You can play with these values and see what you like. Now let's create a new particle system and call it vertical impacts. Increase the duration to 7 seconds and rotate it in the x-axis minus the 90 degrees. This particle system can have a start lifetime of between 0.4 and 3, maybe more. And this one has a very small start speed of 0.05. Now let's just make the start size random between 15 and 30. And you may be wondering what this is for. Well, this requires an image similar to this one and it's going to look like an impact when added to the particle system. You can easily create one in Photoshop or in another image editing software. And this is really easy to create. Let's create a new file with 2000 by 2000. Paint the background to black. And select this custom shape tool. And in this drop down menu, select this shape. Now we can personalize it with the pen tool or by pressing P. And if you hold Ctrl, the white arrow will appear, which will allow us to move the vertices around until we reach a shape similar to this one. Now press 2 times in the shape layer to have access to the layer style and turn on outer glow. Change it to white and play with the size and spread of the glow. To make this smoother, we also want to add some Gaussian blur in the filters. And let's adjust the outer glow again, and finally we can hide the black background and export to Unity as a PNG. Let's create a new material with the same name and change the shader to Particles Additive. Finally, drag the image to the material slot and the material to the particle system. Okay, so let's give some color to this and we can choose random between 2 colors. And now let's give a warm feeling and also make sure that we decrease the alpha of both colors to something like this. Now, since they are all together, we want to go to the shape and set the angle to 0. Increase the radius and increase the radius to around 3. We also want to use the bursts and not a constant rate over time, so let's set it to 0 and add 4 bursts. That starts at 0, then goes to 0.2, 0.4 and 0.6, and every burst will add more particles, like this. Now let's turn on color over lifetime and change it to a warm color at the beginning, as you can see. This is really up to you, you can choose any color if you want. Now we need to turn on size over lifetime and change the graph to one similar to this, which basically gets bigger really quick at the beginning and stays like that until the half of the lifetime, and then it gets smaller. Now let's go to the renderer and change the billboard to vertical and set the max particles to at least 3. Now for this to look interesting in terms of smoke, we need at least 3 sources of smoke, and we are going to start with the black smoke. And we need a new particle system and a new material, which this time will have a different shader, and it is the multiply that we want to select in the particles. Rename it to black smoke, and we need an image, which this time we can Google it, can look for smoke PNG. Import it to Unity and drop on the material slot. Drop the material to the particle system, and we can make the color darker like this, maybe decrease the opacity, that's up to you. Now increase the duration to 7, like the other particle systems, and change the lifetime to between 0.8 and 3. I think it's a good value. And also change the start speed to 0.15 and 1.5, and start size to around 0.2 and 4. We can also make the start rotation between 0 and 360 degrees. And again, we don't use rate over time in this effect, we use bursts. And this particle system will have 4 bursts that starts at 0, 0.1, 0.3 and 0.6. Each one has a minimum and a maximum of 100. Again, you can also play these values, this is just what I found that looks good. And this is way too small, so let's go to the shape and increase the radius like this. And now this is almost done, just smooth the beginning and the ending in the color of a lifetime to something similar to this. Finally, in the size of our lifetime, we want a curve like this one. And don't forget to go to render and set the max particle size to 3. Now the second particle system can be called round smoke, since it's going to emit smoke from the center to the outside. We need to create a new material with the shader set to particles additive, and I'm going to use the same image that I used for the black smoke. Drop the material to the round smoke, and now let's make a few changes. Like the duration is 7 as always, and we need to set a random value for the start lifetime and the start speed. And these are the end values, you can pause and copy. And since we want to emit from the center to the outside, we are going to change the shape to this format. And make sure that emit from is set to emit from volume shell. Okay, this seems alright. Now let's set up our bursts in the emission parameter, set the rate over time to 0, and we want 4 bursts. And the bursts are going to be at 0, 0.4, 0.8 and 1.2. And at 0.8 is when we want a big burst of smoke, as you can see. Let's go ahead and change the color and set the start size to random between 1.2 and 4, as well as the start rotation between 0 and 360 degrees. In color of a lifetime, I'm gonna use this preset, but you can use whatever you want. Just make sure that the beginning and the ending are transparent. In the size over lifetime, I like to use this curve, you can try other things, as always. And finally, in the renderer, set the max particles to 3. And we can move on to the next smoke, which can be duplicated from the round smoke and rename it to center smoke. And what we need to do is go to the shape and change the emit from to base. And we can see that this is already starting to look like something. Okay, so now the smoke is done, let's add a new particle system to create the particles. And rotate it minus 90 degrees in the x-axis. And we can use the same material we used for the ground beam. And you can try other things, obviously. Okay, so let's change the duration to 7 as well, and for the particles. And for the particles like this, what matters is creating a lot of randomness. And give the sensation that they are being pulled from the center to the outside real quick. And we are going to change the start lifetime, the start speed and start size to random values like these ones. Now what really matters is changing the shape of the cone to something with an angle between 45 and 60, maybe more. And let's add 4 bursts with these values. And now we want to add some more natural randomness with the velocity over lifetime parameter. And set a random value for each axis between 2 and minus 2, like this. This is going to give a natural randomness, which is great. Now we only need to turn on color over lifetime and the size over lifetime. Play with the color and with the curve for the size over lifetime. Let's go to the renderer and change the render mode to stretchable board, and now we can increase the spread scale to a small value like 0.05, which will stretch the particles just a little bit, which gives this nice effect of particles moving real quick. Now I'm going to decrease this max start size to around 0.4. And now we need to create rocks. And the rocks are made with 3D models, which I created in Blender. And what I did is I made the UVs separately, then I grouped these pointy rocks and created this smaller rock, which we are going to need in just a moment. And you can create something similar. The idea is that it gets pointy at the top and they are a little bit twisted in the middle and they are larger in the bottom. And by the way, if you want to support in Patreon, this will also be available in the same package of the effects. Okay, so when you are done modeling the rocks, you can export as an FBX to Unity and then create a new particle system, rename it to rocks and rotate it -90 degrees in the x-axis. Also set the duration to 7. And now to add 3D objects to the particle system, we can go to Renderer and in the render mode select Mesh. And now we can insert the mesh, and I'm going to use the rocks that I created. They probably start really small because we need to increase the start size to around 50, in my case. Let's also set the start speed to 0, since we don't want this to move up, at least for now. And decrease the max particles to around 10. At least for me that's what it works best, because I have a few rocks grouped, but you may need to play around with these values if you created your own rocks. Now we can understand better what is going on. Let's also set the rate over time to 0 and add one burst with a minimum and a maximum of 8, at least for now. And this is all transparent because that's the default material that is added to the rocks. And we can change it in the renderer, and I'm going to choose lava, which is a texture that I had around here for a long time, and I created the other maps with Crazy Bump. It's an old software but it gets the job done. Nothing really special, you can create this in just 2 or 3 minutes. And after we add the material, we want to change the start lifetime to between 2.5 and 4, maybe more. Let's change the shape, and we want to set the angle to 90 and the radius to around 4. Now, for this to come from the ground, we need 2 things. The first thing is the size over lifetime, which we have a curve like this one. And it basically tells the rocks to grow really quick in the beginning, and then they abruptly stop and hold on to that size until the end of the lifetime to decrease rapidly. Now the second thing we need is the velocity over lifetime. And I'm going to use the curve of the Z because it's the Z that's pointing up. And we basically create a graphic similar to the one we created in the size over lifetime, but the difference is that these will move the rocks up and down. So you may need to move this particle system a little bit down in the ground. Now we have a very useful parameter that will let us randomize the shape of the 3D model, and it's the 3D start size. And after doing some tests I found out that a minimum of 40 and a maximum of 70 in the X and Y axis are good. More than that, and it will create a lot of distortion and unproportional objects. At least with these rocks. And values of 30 and 80 are enough to make some rocks smaller and others taller. We also want to turn on 3D start rotation to make sure that they are born with different rotation in the X, Y and Z axis. And for me, a minimum of -15 and a maximum of 15 for the X and Y axis are good, and a minimum of -90 and a maximum of 90 were enough for the Z. And this will create a lot of randomness, which is great in my opinion. Every time this particle system is used, it will give a different effect with different rock size and different rocks rotation and position. It's really great. And to end this, we need 2 more particle systems with smaller rocks. One is to create the rocks in the outside, and the other one will spawn some small rocks in the inside. So let's create a new particle system and rename it to rocks outside. Change the duration and rotate it -90 degrees in the x-axis. Then we want to load another rock, the one that I've shown in Blender. And select the material that I already had here. Now, since this is going to be the rocks that will appear around the particle system, we want to go to the shape and change the angle to 90, the radius to around 4.5, and now we want to set the emit from to volume shell. Finally, let's decrease the length to around 2, maybe less. I'm gonna limit the max particles to 250 and set the rate over time to 0. So we can use 3 bursts, one at 0, the other at 0.1 and the last at 0.3, with a minimum of 50 and a maximum of 100 in each burst. If you want, you can only use one burst. Now let's make the start lifetime random between 2 and 4, and now we do the same thing we did with the pointy rocks. So let's turn on 3D start size, and we want these values to create some random sized rocks. Also turn on 3D start rotation, and we set more or less the same values we have used before. Let's turn on size over lifetime and use a curve similar to this one, which will quickly make the rocks bigger in the beginning, like if they are coming out of the ground, and then at the end they will quickly go away. Finally, we just need to duplicate this particle system, and we basically only need to go to shape and change the emit from to base. And you can also decrease the max particles to around 100. And that's pretty much it, guys. We have created, in my opinion, a great ground attack with rocks. It looks like from the Elder Scrolls of Oblivion or from Doom, something like that. And it's really great in my opinion. I have enjoyed a lot doing this effect. And feel free to ask any questions you may have. And I hope you have learned something new. If you want to have access to these effects and more, you already know you can support me on my Patreon, and I will appreciate a lot if you do. And thanks for watching, guys, subscribe for weekly game development videos, and see you in the next tutorial.